Hi everyone. As you can see, I'm running out of ideas for the background. So since we have one more lecture for Wednesday, if you have anything very interesting that I haven't used it, then you're welcome to send them to me. Quick thing before we begin, I just want to make a quick reminder that your final tasks, the paper and presentations, are due on Monday, next Monday. So you have a week. Please send them to me by email. Again, if you have any questions, I got some questions and I helped as much as I can for some of you that send me some ideas and some questions. So you're still welcome to send them to me. Let me share my screen as always, and we can start today's topic. All right. So today we'll complete the discussion about what was described in the syllabus as the new type of terrorism. Today we'll talk about lone wolves. But first of all, as always, quick review. On Friday, I have talked about what's called CBRN terrorism, which is different types of weapons of mass destruction: chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. Various definitions and the various uses in the past. What are the incentives for terror groups to use those kinds of weapons? Mostly, it's probably the most powerful costly signals they can send, creating mass casualties in order to demonstrate their resolve and their willingness to impose cost on the target to achieve their goals. It provides organizational prestige, and of course, if the ideology that the group follows is a kind of the apocalyptic type, then it fits very well. Then we talked about the papers that I tried to find systematic and organizational and ideological factors that leads terror groups to get to this decision to pursue those weapons. We saw some of the important effects that were supported in the paper, the Asal et al. Paper, about global integration, economic integration, especially having alliances and networks with other groups, and the importance of having experience in political violence. And then the incentives to avoid, to refrain from using those kinds of weapons. We talked about lack of interest, but why it's not really the case. This is lack of interest in generating mass casualties and the difficulties to obtain and procure the weapons, that a lot of them are actually can be overcome today because there's a lot more access globally. So that's this topic. If you have any questions, as always, you're welcome to send them to me. So lone wolf terrorism, as always, we'll start with definitions. So there's a lot of different definitions. The one that you see on top here, an individual operative that has no ties to a foreign organization and is very difficult to detect. So there's a more narrow definition offered in a study, a 2010 study, which again has some of those same characteristics as the first definition you have here. The main point of contentions is whether the operative has to have no ties, to direct formal ties to any kind of organizations, whether it is limited ties, whether he has ties and he executes the attacks by himself. So there's a lot of contentions regarding the extent of connections between the operative itself and whether he has any kind of connections, of course, with a terror organization. So that's the point here. Some of the famous cases that of lone wolves terrorism over the last 20, 30 years. So Ted Krasinski was the Unabomber. There's actually a very nice documentary about him now on Netflix if you're interested. He's an anarchist who opposed the advancements put forth by the industrial and technological revolution. So he's tried to fight against that. That's some of his attacks during the 1980s and 90s. David Copland was a neo-Nazi and far-right militant, attacked in London during the late 1990s. His bombs were a nail bomb, so it created a lot of casualties. The third attacker, I talked about Breivik already, who made also he was following a radical right-wing ideology. White supremacy ideology in Norway. His attacks in 2011 were pretty shocking for the Norwegian population. And the operator in France is the attack in Nice. This is the ramming attack, which I've given you the survey early on in the semester. If you remember, 86 people died by his track ramming attack. And he was inspired by jihadists, but there's no clear connection between that. So that's just some of those attacks. This slide shows attacks in the US in terms of lone wolf attacks. You see the number of fatalities, the number of injuries, and you see the increase in the number of those kinds of numbers, especially in the late 2010s overall. So that's some data from the last couple of years. All right. As always, let's go a little bit about the background. So the origins of lone wolf's attacks go all the way back to the 1930s, and criminals were described that way. A lot of the criminals that operated alone were seen or described by the media or by authorities that were seeking for them as lone wolves. A more accepted start for the use of this terminology, especially with respect to terrorism, has been in the 1980s. Associating the term of lone wolf with a right-wing extremist. So a right-wing extremist in the name of Beam has published his manifesto. It was called Leaderless Resistance. He emphasized the need to operate with using one-man cells, which is, again, fits here with the lone wolf logic. To counter the most powerful government in the world, it was mostly, of course, he was opposing the American government. Tom Metzger, who was a leader of the White Aryan Resistance Group, inspired with his radical right-wing ideology, a lot of hate crimes over those years. Those hate crimes have persisted for many years during the 1990s. A counteroffensive by the FBI in the late 1990s and 1998 stopped this specific individual. Ever since 9/11, there's an expansion in the number of individuals who are operating by themselves, and a lot of them are inspired by the global jihad ideology. Just reminding you again, one that we talked about, even though we're not clear 100% that he was a lone wolf or he was inspired by a jihadi ideology or just a right-wing ideology, it was the attack in Orlando that we talked about earlier in the semester. So this is some of the more famous attacks. In the beginning of the previous century, the 2010s, there was a little bit more an increase in the use of those kinds of attacks, especially associating those kinds of attacks with terrorism. Some of the famous attacks. The attack in a U.S. Army base in Fort Hood here in Texas in 2009 with 13 dead was commenced by a lone individual who was inspired by jihad propaganda. In 2008, an individual who was converted to Islam tried to blow up a restaurant in England based on those ideology. There's a growth in the online propaganda that's called for offensive using those one-man cells, as similar to the Leaderless Resistance Manifesto that was published way back in the 1980s. Now, one thing to remember is that the use or the terminology of lone wolves has become very dominant in the media and other kinds of outlets, even politicians, to describe those kinds of attacks, but it must be taken more cautiously. Why? Because it is used in many cases as kind of a knee-jerk or instant analysis following attacks such as the Boston Marathon, a very famous terror incident, the attacks in France and Germany and England. Those kinds of attacks were described very early on as lone wolf attacks. But in the vast majority of those cases, a later investigation found out that the lone wolf label or term was misplaced because they showed that the perpetrators had extensive support for different groups. So this is one of the problems with this kind of using this kind of terminology, especially when we're trying to provide instant analysis to terror incidents. The bottom line is the prototype lone wolf terrorists are almost impossible to come by. They have all some form of connection to a social group or any kind of other group. It can be just a terror organization, whether it is a direct interaction, whether it is just being inspired by their ideology online. So it's very hard to find a prototype lone wolf who comes out of nowhere. but still we have to put them on some kind of scale. So now I want to talk about different issues related to research on lone wolf terrorism. So the research includes work which mostly address the strategic logic of operating alone, how that kind of terrorism methods affect the threat perceptions of the public, of the government, the different narratives that promote the lone wolf actions, and focus on case of methodology a lot on the use of case studies, because we don't have a lot of incidents. So the main puzzle when we think about research on lone wolf is, why is this kind of terrorist so unique? What makes it so dangerous? So the first, of course, very simple, it's very hard to detect an individual who works by themselves and not with anybody else. The fact that those kinds of operatives are working by themselves makes sure that they don't have any kind of restrictions in terms of any organizational protocols. So organizational restrictions, and we talked a lot about those different dynamics, may discourage kind of creative actions from execution or delays in operations. Once the individuals operate that by itself, there's no problem of those nature. The response for an attack commenced by lone wolf operator is less restricted to repressive action because it operates by itself. It not necessarily represents or related to any kind of group, so that makes it also unique on some level. And lastly, and this actually comes back a little bit to more general theory, a lone wolf operative is ideal for many terror groups, even if they're associated indirectly or from very far, because it solves what's called the collective action problem. The question is, how does a terror group motivate and mobilize a lot of members to actually take actions when there's a tendency to free ride? And the example here in this case, we can leave terrorism aside from it and think about just protests that we want to take part of. So if a lot of people are going out to protest for some reason, am I going to participate in those kinds of demonstrations and risk the fact that I might get arrested or something like that because I'm participating in political actions, while the benefit that I get from participation are probably going to be very, very low, if anything. So there's a lot of free riders. There's people that allegedly support a protest but do not want to take the actual action. So that's a collective action problem. Same thing can happen for terrorists. A lot of people may support the agenda or the objectives of the terror group, but not a lot of them are willing to actually participate and take part. So by having someone who operates by itself, there's no collective action problem. With respect to the research I'm going to talk about for today, I want to talk about two studies. The first study is the Gill et al. Paper, which is more descriptive and focus on the individual characteristics or individual aspects of lone wolf terrorists, trying to identify what is the profile of those kinds of attackers. And the other is a recent study by Brian Phillips, who tries to find more of a structural systematic analysis regarding comparing lone wolf operatives with terror groups. So beginning with the Gill et al. Paper, they focus on the behavioral aspects and the demographic aspects of perpetrators, trying to identify their differences and trying to identify the profile of what are those operatives. So they conceptualize three groups of operatives. The first is the individuals, which may be the closest fit we can think about to the prototype. Lone wolves operate autonomously and independent of any group. Their second category is those who have some links to groups with respect to previous training or kind of support, but their operations are completely independent of the group. And then there's what they call these isolated dyads, who are pairs. Instead of just one lone wolf, so maybe you can call this a lone wolf cell, two individuals who plan, prepare, and execute an attack outside of the group settings. So one thing to think about that they talk is that sometimes those kinds of dyads are formed for just operational reasons. It's maybe two individuals from the same who will operate by themselves would form together in order to improve the odds of a successful attack. So that's one thing. So the study addresses several categories of those factors. They look at demographics, very basic demographic factors. Then they look at the antecedent behavior, which is the daily routine and the interaction of the perpetrators with others, how that may lead us to identify those kinds of individuals. Specific factors that relate to the event, the method that they use, the target that they selected, and whether there's any kind of post-event behavior, such as credit claiming. We talked about that with respect to cyber terrorism, but it's also related to individual terrorists, and whether there's anything related to the arrest. So they use the data regarding 119 individuals that engage or plan to engage in lone wolf terrorism, either in the US or in Europe since 1990. So in terms of the results, I will show some of the results. We'll talk also with some visual aids for that. So we'll try to make it a little bit more interesting than we're just talking about results. So there you go. That's our first picture of the day. So this is the age distribution of lone wolf operatives compared to other groups. So we have the ETA that we're familiar with and the PIRA, which you're also familiar with. One of the things we can see here is that lone wolves are very different from terror groups operatives in terms of the age distribution, that a vast proportion of lone wolf operatives are relatively older. So we can see here that the 30 plus represent about 50% of lone wolf operatives compared to other groups which have a much a lower percentage. The proportion of attackers over 30 is almost 2.5 times more than the mid-age of individuals in both of the other groups, such as the PIRA or ETA. So this is one demographic finding we can identify for lone wolves. These two figures break down operatives based on their level of education, as well as their different times of employment. We cannot find any clear differences among them. You can see the thing that we can see here is that most terrorists along all those groups fit in terms of education to have some form of formal education, whether it is just undergraduate degree, high school education, even in some university education. So again, this comes back to our discussion early on. The terrorists are only those who are lacking any kind of education. So in this case, we can discount this argument, but again, we don't see any kind of differences between those who are part of groups compared to lone wolf. Similarly, for employment status, sorry. So there is maybe a little bit higher extent of lone wolves who are unemployed, but not necessarily. The differences are not that big or not that significant compared to other groups. So that's the main thing we can think about. Most lone wolves have are less likely to be employed, but other than that, we don't see any too much of a clear differences in terms of employment status. They also address issues such as gender, and they find that the overwhelming majority of lone wolf operatives are male. We do have examples for females who were lone operatives. So for example, Chaudhry in Britain attacked members of the Labour Party, revenge for the events in Iraq in 2010. So a Labour Party in Britain, of course. Here in the US, Shannon was also an individual female lone wolf operatives that was associated with multiple attacks on abortion clinics in the 1990s. So there are examples for women who were lone wolves, but it seems that the vast majority seems to be mostly male. Another dominant factor is the association of those individuals with what's called illegal activities. So many of those individuals who are lone wolves had previous criminal record. It is higher for this group, so the proportion of lone wolves with a previous criminal conviction is higher than other groups. The extent of offenses that they were convicted of was varied. There's some minor offenses such as tag fraud, all the way to very severe types of offenses that you can see here written on the slide. And this finding is unique to lone wolves and is an important one because in many cases, terror groups will prefer to recruit individuals who don't have past criminal records in order to prevent any kind of raised red flags from police monitoring or military monitoring or the state monitoring the group as a whole. When it comes to the lone wolf categories, then this kind of screening is less evident, so there's a lot less restrictions in terms of illegal or criminal background. They also showed that over 60% of the lone wolves served time in jail, which we have already seen in the 2 movies that I've sent you, and I talked about this a few times, that it tends to expedite the radicalization process. Okay, the next set of results talks about ideology. So we see here that the vast majority of operatives are following one of 2 dominant ideologies. One of them is the more of the radical jihad ideology, following Al-Qaeda inspired, with over 40%, and about a third of the sample are following of a right-wing radical ideology. So that's another breakdown of lone wolves in this case. A few more of their findings. So they talk about awareness of intentions, and it talks about, and this related mostly for the environment of the operatives. So, and the way that, and that's of course a function of the way that the perpetrators themselves behave. So they find that those operatives were not too secretive with their radical worldview or their intention to engage in violence. Over 60% of the cases that they have in their sample, there's evidence that a family member or any kind of close friends were aware of the intentions, which again suggests or talks about the important role that the surrounding environment of those individuals play in preventing those kinds of attacks. And they mentioned other pre-event factors such as the economic situation. So I showed you the figure about the employment status. Many of them, it's not about necessarily being unemployed, it's many of them were recently employed. So about a quarter from their sample, and within their group of unemployed terrorists that they view in this paper, about a quarter lost their job in the 6 months prior to the attack. So that's like kind of an immediate or short-term incentive that may lead them to engage in those kinds of actions. Most were what's called chronically unemployed, so they had a hard time finding employment for a long time. And about a quarter of them talked about having chronic financial problems. They also talked about stress. They did find that about a third experience growing what's called stress conditions, but there are no clear factors that differentiate among most perpetrators. Going a little bit outside of the individuals into the network, which is an important one. So they find that a third of the lone wolves joined the group that before they engaged in their own attack, they actually joined the group that engaged in a legal political contention before their actions. These groups usually share kind of some form of ideology or worldview with the perpetrator. And that means that serves as kind of an indirect group support for those who turn up eventually to be lone wolves operatives. The relations with the group, whether it is direct or indirect, provides to the individuals access to material and propaganda which can even enhance their radicalization process. About a third of them has friends or family members which were associated with a political movement or a criminal network. So again, kind of relations, even if those are indirect or a little bit further away, relations to different forms of violent political contention, of violent or use of violence to promote some goals. And many of the network contacts are actually aware of the intended attacks. They talk about the fact that in a third of the cases, the lone wolves themselves try to recruit their friends or their family members to join the group, the operations, I'm sorry. In other cases, there is a substantial awareness of the regarding the research of the operatives about where he or she will conduct their attacks and the planning of the attack by other members. So the more than 50% of the cases, other members of the network of the individual perpetrator were aware of the planning of an operation, which again points back to the idea that those individuals are very, very important in preventing the attack. Finally, some finding regarding their very specific attack-related factors. So most of the lone wolves, over 20% of them, were trained by themselves. No, sorry, the number is 20% for those who were associated with other, and all the rest are more likely associated, not associated with any group. So they were self-trained. They obtained by themselves the manuals for how to use explosives and how to be ready for the attack. So there's some help in training and preparation for close associates who may be related to any kind of a terror group, but a lot of them actually were self-trained, which fits to their definition as lone wolves. In terms of targets, about a third of them target civilians or government-related targets. Some of there's less targeting of religious center, which is maybe on some level surprising, especially when we saw the association with ideologies such as the right-wing ideology. But at the same time, there's less targeting of military targets, which makes sense because targeting a military asset like a military base or a police station requires a lot more sophistication and resources, which is very, very hard for an operative who works by itself. In terms of the weapons used, there's a wide variation in the types of weapons used. This is data from the FBI regarding the method of attack. As you can see, just take this under very, very careful consideration. There's only 52 data points here, but still, you can see that most of them use firearms, which probably are the easiest to obtain and to also use. So this is just some data regarding the attack themselves. These findings regarding the attacks and everything that I talked about earlier show that there's very few common characteristics that that can help us construct a very clear profile for lone wolf operatives. So it's very hard to make this kind of an individual, identify this kind of individuals. Talks a little bit about age, some of the employment background, the very individual specific ones. But again, it's very, very hard to look at the profile of an individual who may be radicalized and think that they are more likely to engage in lone wolf attack or any kind of other attacks. That's the Gilliland paper. Again, gives us a pretty much descriptive sense of this topic. And that's what a lot of the studies are doing when they're looking at the individual level data, trying to identify the individuals and find those profiles. Before I move on to the Phillips paper, which looks a little bit more, takes a more wider scale approach to this study, I want to start for our attendance word for today. So attendance is going to be cell phone. That's for today. And now we can move on. So the other paper is the Phillips paper, which addresses structural organizational factors in order to understand or to compare between terror groups and lone wolves. And the question that he addresses, first and foremost, is who of those two values of the category is more lethal. So lone wolves operatives are more lethal, or operations by terror groups are more lethal. So he, in his description of his conceptual framework, he talks about why would terror groups will be more lethal. So let's look at the first one. The first one actually addresses an organizational dynamic. So internal dynamics, the need to ensure survival is a clear organizational factor. All of this, and we talked about that a lot, at least for 1 or 2 lectures in the previous weeks. All these provide incentives to execute attacks regularly and all the time. So that means that terror groups, because of those internal dynamics, are more likely to be more lethal, to execute more attacks. Groups attack may be riskier. You remember, I hope you remember we talked about the risks of leadership turnover and internal dissent within groups, which makes it more likely that the groups are going to take risks and implement those kinds of attacks. And the most clear example for that is the use of suicide terrorism. Is more relevant for a group context, and again is much more lethal than most forms of attacks. Other factors related, especially for the organizational category of events, groups have easier access to resources, having logistical network in terms of weapons, in terms of transportation, being able to move the perpetrator around, and having the safe houses for the post-attack situation, those kinds of advantages eventually translate into public concerns, the way that the public views terror groups compared to individuals. Because they have more resources, they seem as much more dangerous than individuals. And it also means that this is one of the reasons for lone wolves to associate themselves in groups. Why? Because if you're just individuals, you might create some of the fear factor, which is very, very important, of course, for terrorism. But by associating himself or herself with a group, the lone wolf hopes to accomplish more in terms of creating more psychological effect of fear, which is, as we already established in the past weeks, is a very important factor for terrorists. So the main structural factor that he uses in order to describe the difference in extent of how lethal are the attacks between terror groups and individuals is the state capacity. States which have developed counterterrorism capabilities makes it much harder to terror groups to make their operations successfully and efficiently. The communication between members of the groups is monitored under these capacity conditions. Security forces are much more apt to prevent terror attacks. All those kinds of actions are much less effective when we think about lone wolf operatives, right? So policing, informants, and civilians, we talked about how important they really are for the ones that we are aware of, but when we're trying to find them in advance, it's much harder to use informants and civilians and surveillance to identify lone wolves. And the bottom line for this dynamic and those differences in the counterterrorism capabilities of states is that lone wolves will be much more lethal in states which have higher counterterrorism capacity, right? Once again, because when states have high counterterrorism capacity, it makes it much harder for terror groups to operate, but it's not necessarily that helpful when it comes to preventing a lone wolf attack. So he measures lethality using the number of fatalities in terror incidents over a long period of time, globally, of course. And overall, he finds that groups are more deadly in terms of their results. But when he began to subsample his data and look at specific cases, then he found a little bit more of an interesting finding in terms of comparisons between groups and individuals. So for example, when he looked only at the US sample, which again is a state which has a high and robust counterterrorism capabilities, so on average, the extent of casualties or fatalities from a terror attack by lone wolves was much higher. In this case, almost 1.5 times higher than attacks by groups, which is an important finding. He found also similar finding in terms of the trend of the data with respect to France, another country which has strong counterterrorism capabilities. And it's important to understand, even though he took the time frame of 1970 to 2010, in both cases, he excluded 9/11. So we can't say that the US is a problem or less of a problem without 9/11, but still, without 9/11, still, the US and France, two countries which has strong counterterrorism capabilities, have much more lethal lone wolf attacks. And those kinds of findings are important in terms of the policy implications they have. What he argues that there is a need to increase the emphasis of those kinds of threat instead of emphasizing just transnational attacks by groups, which are less likely to be effective or to be that effective in countries with this kind of a high level counterterrorism capabilities. So that's his finding in terms of putting it in a more structural, systematic aspect, comparing between terror groups and lone wolves. And that's just another kind of paper that I wanted you to be aware of some of the research about this topic. So to summarize this topic, the main challenge for this research begins from defining who is a lone wolf. How can we characterize, and that's what was one of the main implications we can think about from the Gill et al. Paper. How can we characterize those individuals, their profile, and look at very specific factors such as their relationship with groups or networks, and how do we place that as part of the definition? What role does the ideology, in this case, whether it is right-wing ideology, radical religious ideology, whatever that is, how that plays into the definition? And why is that important? Those are critical questions, not just for research, they're critical questions for policymaking. But our definitions, and that comes back all the way to one of the first lectures that we had this semester, the way that we define this issue that we're trying to address impacts the way that we conceptualize the way that we are going to study that, or the way that we design our policy for that, the data we collect, the analysis that we conduct afterwards, and the implications that may have. So again, our data collection and empirical analysis is contingent upon our definition of what is a lone wolf terrorism, and that's going to affect the eventual implications and any kind of recommendations for policy. So again, the way that once we know more clearly, or once we'll have a more consensus definition of lone wolf, it might make it easier to fight this phenomena. But this is it's still an early topic, which is under study. All right, so there's a couple of more studies here if you're interested in reading. Wednesday's lecture this Wednesday is going to be our final lecture for this semester. And I'll give you one more reminder again regarding the final paper and final presentations. And I will see you all on Wednesday.